folks, Craig Lavati here with the Houston Museum of Natural Science. This is, of course, the Beyond Bones podcast, now available on YouTube where you're watching us right now, and all the other funky little podcast apps that you can have downloaded onto your phone. Thank you for letting us travel with you. Kat, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good, Craig. I'm here in the cat cave in the basement. So doing good.
I missed you guys the last few weeks, but I'm back and I'm ready to go. And today we are talking to my good friend, my show buddy, Justin Stapleton from KPRC. He is a part of the, are you like the weather czar there, Justin Stapleton?
You know, we don't like to use terms like czar. I like to think of it more as like the weather wizard aficionado.
Weather wizard.
Oh, nicely.
Okay. Weather wizard works. I think we should definitely leave it.
Doesn't fit on lower third and on television though, Craig. So that's why I only do it for things like podcasts and whatnot, since we don't have those parameters we have to deal with.
And right when you logged in, I was like, he put on his work shirt for this.
I did. Well, it's one of the, if you only knew that I have my running shorts and flip-flops on underneath this here, I'm in true pandemic, post-pandemic Zoom.
We're never going to go back to wearing normal clothes, I guess. Justin, as the weather wizard, what does hurricane season 2022 look like to you so far?
You know, it's going to be, I think, an interesting year on three fronts. The first is the fact that we're still in a fairly stout La Nina pattern. And so if your listeners aren't familiar with that, there's two main global patterns that we generally watch as we go in towards the summer months. One's called an El Nino. One's called a La Nina. La Nina pattern for us here across the Gulf Coast states, and in particular Texas, generally will mean hotter, drier forecast overall, just in terms of the weather. However, it also means that there's not as much wind shear or sort of a jet stream flying across the Gulf of Mexico. And that's one of the factors that can help limit tropical development. So when those little storms try to get in there, or like the homegrowns that try to form underneath the area of low pressure, that wind sometimes will sort of shear it apart, if you want to think of it that way, just kind of like shearing taffy. So the stronger those winds are, the less possibility there is for above average development. And this is all statistically based. So you can't say, well, this will absolutely cause no hurricanes, but it may cause a situation for it to be a little less. In a La Nina pattern, which is what we're in now, that strong wind is not as strong. So there's not as much ability to rip some of those potential storms apart. So that's one thing that we watch for. Second thing that we watch for is the potential for what are the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico right now. And it's interesting because we've actually got Chief Meteorologist Frank Billingsley, who's with me at KPRC2, just did a blog on this week about that the sea surface temperature in the western side of the Gulf of Mexico, so that's, you know, Brownsville, Corpus on down towards northern Mexico, that temperature of the water is the warmest that we've ever seen at this time in May, which is somewhat alarming because warm water, as we always say, is basically gas for the hurricane's fire, right?
It feeds the hurricane.
You got it, right. Yeah, it'll feed it. And the hotter that water is, or the warmer that water is, the more juice or potential it has to be able to use that for what we call rapid intensification, right? The storm itself will probably develop into whatever kind of form it is, whatever potential growth rate. But what we found over the last at least 5 years, and going back even further, is that storms that we've noticed the last couple of years have rapidly intensified as they get real close to the shores. They're sucking in that gas and just blowing up. We saw it in northern Mexico last summer. We saw it, I believe, in Nicholas did the same thing as well, really beefed up right before landfall. And that's something I think that not only us here locally across the greater Houston area is, but I can assure you that the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane folks have a bit of a raised eyebrow. We've been reading some information from chatter that they've had going and getting ready for the season, that they're curious to see if we're not going to see another lead to that type of a situation this summer.
Because it's already, and I know you've already talked about this too on Twitter, and we can follow you at what's your Twitter?
It's just KPRC2 Justin. Super simple.
That's right. I know it. I talk to you all the time on there, but I can't say it. You've been talking a little bit about the sort of the drought situation we also have going on too.
Absolutely. And I think that's the third factor here in our summer. Now, a higher potential for drought doesn't mean we're going to have, a quiet hurricane season. There, one does not cause the other. There may be correlation, but there's no causation to it. Yeah. What's interesting about that is that what we're seeing now are seeing bits and pieces of what we saw in 2011. If you remember how dry and hot 2011 was, then we had the wildfires across central Texas that scorched, a good percentage of the trees in through the hill country. That's something that the hydrologists at the Weather Service are watching very carefully. Their question is to say, if we're going into a hurricane season here, if we're going into the summer with this rainfall deficit, in some cases, in Galveston, for example, they're up, I'd want to say it's close to 7 inches below average for the year so far. And that's substantial, right?
Yeah.
Now, one tropical system isn't going to be a drought buster, right? Because you can't say exactly where does that bullseye on. It goes right where the drought is the worst. Well, it doesn't generally work like that. But it is interesting to see that sometimes these droughts can create negative feedback loops. Mm-hmm. So for example, if I've got a hot area of high pressure right over top of central Texas, that create hot, dry conditions, which only feed more hot, dry conditions.
Right.
Ridge of high pressure can help to steer or bounce away potential systems that may try to get into the Gulf, which would only make the drought situation worse since we can't get a good soaking.
Yeah. Or you can have 40 inches at one time and 2 miles away, you can have 10.
You get nothing. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Stevie Ray Vaughan said it best, right? They called it Texas flood song for a reason. You either get it or you don't. Feast or famine.
That's just it's, and I know every year, especially now since Harvey, and you were there with us for Harvey, obviously. Yep. And every year since Harvey, I think the PTSD just gets stronger for what we went through.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point too. That's sort of the human aspect of this, I think, that gets dropped sometimes. From a science standpoint, we can talk about all the scientific, well, this model is showing us this, and this global parameter is showing us this. But I can tell you, even last Thursday, when we had some of those stronger thunderstorms come through, thankfully, none of it caused any damage, but it was a pretty healthy squall line that ripped its way through. I got to tell you guys, I probably answered more than a dozen Facebook messages and Instagram just from people that just said, hey, am I going to get flooded on this thing? Right. Because there are people that went through either Harvey or the tax day flood in 2016 or Memorial Day in 2015. And they're still dealing with some of the after effects of that, with insurance, with having to move, with it depleted some of their savings. So there's a huge human aspect of this I think is something that as a meteorologist, a broadcast meteorologist who interacts with the public there, that's something I know myself, the rest of our weather team has really started to beef up in our language of being careful about how we phrase things as well going forward. So it's not, we're sensitive to understanding that this may be a trigger for some folks as well.
Sure. And in Texas weather too, I mean, not only were you traumatized with rain and hurricanes and flooding, but also freezing and any number of other crazy stuff. So I think a lot of people, and tiny bit myself, is a little, every time something unexpected is coming our way.
I never realized that there's a part of your job too, Justin, which is almost like you're a weather therapist. That you kind of have to describe things in a certain way because you don't want to sound like an alarmist, but you also don't want to play something down to the point where there's not a lot of worry.
People ignore it. Exactly right. Yeah. My personal philosophy, and I feel like this sort of reverberates through the entire team at Channel 2, is we are not alarmists, right? Like I don't play that game. I figure that the Texas surprising weather sometimes can be alarming enough just because it decides, you're good. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, look, here's 5 inches. Let me just dump a bucket right on your house. Right. And, we call that Tuesday in June. right? So there's no reason to be an alarmist because the weather will do it on itself here. But I do always like to tell people to say that I won't sound an alarm unless that alarm needs to be sound. And when I do sound it, you need to pay attention and you need to act quickly. And that's kind of what we did with Harvey too. I remember standing in the newsroom talking to the producers, the executive producers, our managers, and news president and whatnot. And it was right about that Wednesday when we finally went to them and we said, okay, look, we think this is going to be big. And they said, how big? And we said, we're not sure. And that kind of got everybody's attention, and then we ramped that language up big time. And I think that gave a good 48 hour enough for folks to at least get some opportunity to try to take some preparations for that. So we always want people to be prepared for hurricane season. You don't want to be standing in line at Home Depot with 900,000 of your cohorts trying to get things that are in scarce supply. So, my advice always is do it now. What is it? Early May, yeah. Opportunity to get it done now because there's plenty of supply for everything.
Between COVID and weather, between COVID, weather, freezing, all of that kind of stuff, I am totally a prepper in some sense. I've got so much water and matches and plastic sheeting and all of this stuff. My daughter's like, what is happening out here? You have a lot of toilet paper and there's a lot of water. I'm like, we are prepared.
That's right.
That's right. For anything.
As long as you left enough toilet paper for everybody as well.
Oh, totally not a hoarder. I bought it a little at a time when it was totally available. And no, I would not hoard. That's not, well, I guess I'm a hoarder, but not in that way.
It's okay. I figure that the hoarding, as long as you're below like 10 cats, you're good. I
don't have that. Yeah, I'm not into cat lady territory quite yet, but I'm pushing it. 3 years.
You're all good at this point. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like so part of my background I did before I got into news here is I've got a master's in clinical psychology and I've worked with police departments for doing crisis intervention work with them in different hospitals for about 12 years before I got into this. So, and going back to what you're saying, Craig, about having to be like the weather psychologist too, I use a lot of the same language that I used to use with either the police or individuals that are dealing with mental illness, substance abuse problems or whatnot that were in critical condition almost every day. Obviously, I don't use the same severity of that language, but being able to convey what you need to convey to people and getting them to understand what's the most important part of the story is something I feel like that I hone those skills doing it then and really bring that in every day. So it's funny. A quick story. I remember during Harvey, I don't know what day it was, Saturday or Sunday, whatever day it was. We've been up for days. And it was probably about 2 a.m. and Frank and I were going back and forth. And I got a message from a fellow the next morning, and he said, "My name is Dr. So-and-so. I'm a ER trauma doc." And he said, "I need you to solve a bet for me and my wife." And he said, "I think you've done either trauma work or you've worked somewhere in emergency services," because he said the language you were using last night when you were talking to us are things that we use in the trauma. And he said, "Have you ever been a trauma, clinician, nurse, or anything like that?" And I kind of laughed. And I told him what I used to do. And he said, I knew it. He said, it was the language you were using with that. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. It's just a switch that you turn on. But yeah.
What are some examples, I guess, of that I probably haven't even noticed?
So I actually went back and found it because I was real curious too. And what I realized, what I was doing at the time, and I didn't realize it just because, I turned the crisis brain on. It was one of those where we were starting to see some of the neighborhoods out west in West Harris County go underwater. And we were starting to see some of the evacuation. And we were also seeing some of that second wave of heavy rain, those spigots that were coming up through Galveston and starting to blast through places like Pearland and Friendswood. And we were getting water rescue calls and people on the roofs. And it was just really getting scary at the point. And I remember I went back and I watched it and I said to everybody, I said, you know what? I said, let's not on air, on a camera. I said, we're not going to worry about the next week. I said, we're not even going to worry about what goes on over the next 24 hours. I said, I need you all to stay with me and we're going to figure out what we need to do over the next 30 minutes. And then once that 30 minutes, we're going to figure out what we need to do for the next 30 minutes after that. And I said, we'll be here with you for each of those 30 minutes. So here's what we're going to do right now. And I didn't even realize I had said that.
And that's really helpful, actually. I was there, I was flooding, I was West Side. And like, just and it must have been you, because it was like, it brings you into focusing on the here and now, surviving, getting done what needs to be done, and putting off that, like, oh my God, my whole life is, going underwater right here and I can't survive.
Yeah, no, it does. And that's in any crisis situation, regardless of whatever the severe event is, that happens. You start to panic because you think this is over and what am I going to do about this? And my gosh, lost all my furniture. And it's like, okay, but right now you're not going to be able to solve any of that. So right now, what's the most immediate need? Most immediate need is I need to make sure that my children, my pets, myself are safe. What are we going to do to accomplish that in the next 30 minutes?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we go to. So that's an example of sort of you bring in some of that crisis training. And like I said, I kind of chuckled the next day because I didn't even realize I did it, because it's just a switch. You just turn it on and just go.
I think there was that coupled with that week, especially, and I can't believe now thinking about it, that's been 5 years. Wild, isn't it? And the scars obviously remain for a lot of people mentally, and obviously like just, home life.
Yeah.
But thinking about that, going back to that week, and we're all talking about, obviously hurricane season because, hurricane season starts June 1st, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it's almost like, I think now ever since then, since 2018, that hurricane season right after Harvey, we've all been sort of ingrained now. We're just kind of like, okay, when is this happening?
Yeah.
And what has changed in terms of your job over the past 5 years? Because I clearly see a difference between the way that weather was treated in Houston before Harvey and after Harvey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have people's attention now is probably the easiest way to say that. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of folks that lived through Allison, lived through Ike, lived through the panic of Rita, which never materialized, but unless you got caught, on 45 for 60 hours or whatever it was. I think that Harvey changed things for people because it was such an immense event. People that had said, oh, well, my roof got a little messed up during Allison, but, I was okay. Or Ike knocked down my house on the Bolivar, but, I rebuilt it. It was okay. Harvey was one of those where I think it just really scared people because it just didn't stop. Right. And that's the panic of it. If you're born and raised in Houston, anywhere on the Gulf Coast, hurricanes are coming. They're eventually going to smack into you. And this will sound a little macabre, but the beauty is that they come in, they make a big god awful mess for, maybe 12 hours and then they're gone. Mm-hmm. Right. And then you're like, oh, okay, well, power's out, and you go and you sweat it out, you figure it out. Harvey just didn't go anywhere. It just got stuck. And I think that's where people really got scared, is like they couldn't see an end to it. And that's when it really got terrifying,
Well, it's like, okay, so a hurricane, you've got like shingles all over your neighborhood or whatever, but Harvey, your whole neighborhood was a ghost town afterwards. Like nobody could live there. In the whole big neighborhood, it was gone.
Yeah, it was
Everybody
gone.
moved out.
Yeah, so I think what's changed is people are more cognizant of when we say, hey, this is one we're watching, we're going to pay attention to this. Mm-hmm. I think they pay attention earlier than they did before. Mm-hmm. And so like what you've done, Kat, there's an enormous amount of people now that have said, you know what, I'm just going to go to Costco and take care of all this in like February and then just put it in the garage. I don't have to deal with it. Second thing I think it's done, and more importantly than people paying attention to us, honestly, Craig, is I think it got public works involved. And I think it got governments. I think it got, regional, state governments and officials. I think it raised their alarm where they finally said, okay, instead of just saying, oh yeah, we need this money for X, Y, and Z, these, high water rescue trucks. And then eventually, okay, it gets cut out of the final budget. And it's like, okay, we'll be all right. We'll be all right. I think it got to the point where they realized, okay, we may not be all right. So we're going to push. Interesting. This weekend, I was talking with Mayor Turner and Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia that were at the East End Street Fest before we introduced them for about 15 minutes. And we got talking about the story that the Houston Fire Department got, I think it's 6 brand new high water rescue vehicles. Before, Harris County, I think, had 1.
Oh, wow.
That was operating. And now they've got 6 new, and then they bought like 4 others. So we've got 10. So station them all over the county in position so that if a storm comes in and things get bad, they don't have to get there. They're already there.
Yeah.
They can load people up. And that sounds not like a big deal. You say, okay, well, yeah, 10 trucks. What did we see during that week?
I was in a dump truck. I was in a trash truck.
Yeah, right. There were people with, the old, what am I thinking? Grave digger, right?
Yeah.
There was a dude that came down to the station, had a souped up old truck that was probably, I don't know, 10 feet off the ground, poked his head out to one of our live crews and was like, hey, do you guys need some help? And they're like, yes, we need help in this neighborhood. So this guy for 12 hours just went in and took people in the back of his truck, had a big old ladder, and he just put it down and just took people out of the neighborhood. Right?
Incredible selflessness. That's for sure.
Yeah.
That was the silver lining out of that whole thing, was the community that became apparent.
Yeah.
It really.
But the vigilance too after that, I remember, was it last year? Maybe it was 2020. Yeah. You remember when we had another hurricane scare sort of in the Gulf, and then it was like it kind of wiggled around and then nothing happened. I remember people almost being aggravated that it didn't hit, because it was like
they were ready.
We were so ready for something to happen again. And then there was like, when it didn't happen, it was that delayed thing. Like, well, darn it. Like I was like, I'm prepared now. Why aren't you, that's a funny thing about trauma, how when you get prepared so well, and then when it doesn't, the worst doesn't happen, you're like, it's almost just like, I don't know how to explain it. It's a strange.
Like, I have my first aid kit and I have my 4-wheel drive, and I'm ready to help.
Test me. Well, I'm ready to be tested.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is you feel like you didn't get an opportunity to test what you can do.
Right.
And it's like, I know I can be better this time through this trauma or whatever it is, and you didn't get that chance to test it. What I always try to tell, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things we used to do, in previous TV life, is we'd always say, if you've got the skills and you've learned from previous trauma events, it's okay if it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. There will be other opportunities where maybe it's not that exact same trauma where you're going to say, I'm going to put all X, Y, and Z that I've learned in here. It may be something adjacent to that. So I need X and Y, but the Z I don't need, but I'm still prepared for whatever that is, even if it's to a lesser degree. So it's like, don't throw all of the bathwater out just because it gets right. Just hang on to it. It's still good.
And also too, like those 2 floods that we had, those tax day and what was it, Memorial Day?
Allison,
Allison too, to an extent, but I think Allison I kind of consider almost prehistory at this point, because it was before social media, and it was before we had people documenting everything.
Yep.
Those 2 first ones were almost like dress rehearsals in a sense, where it was just like, okay. Are we good? Okay, this is how bad it can get, and then bam, Harvey happens.
Right.
But I do think, go ahead.
Oh, I was just sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say, I think they gave way to. Let's go back to what we were talking about with local officials and money and financing. All of 3 of those in particular, Harvey, yes, because that's the biggest one. But both the tax day and the Memorial Day flood in particular finally got people to pay attention that, hey, White Oak Bayou needs to be widened in Meyer. Doesn't go underwater again. And we're going to have a real good test to see when the next one comes. And they're pretty confident. I've talked to Jeff Linder and some of the engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the folks at Harris County Flood Control. You're talking about just kind of waiting and waiting and waiting. This will sound really awful. So, but they're dying for an opportunity to see
how it works.
White Oak works. And I think it will. Theoretically, from the stuff they've shown us, it should be fine, and it's about time, because it's like, what's the neighborhood everyone thinks of when you flood around here? You're like, oh, did you live in Meyerland? Oh, yeah. Okay. Connor, how many times have you flooded in Ireland? You know,
which
I was out there.
Oof.
I was out there not too long ago, and they were talking. I was at a event over there, and they were saying that what was so crazy about Ireland is that one street got it and the other street wouldn't.
Yep.
And it was just the luck of the draw, or just.
Yeah. The only big trouble spots I see now, two things that will be really interesting to watch. One, I'm hoping and hopeful that there's going to be a bigger push on some zoning regulations and restrictions so that we don't have more Bear Creeks, more Addicks Reservoir situations, because, those developers literally built in a bowl.
Yeah.
Right. And so if a bowl floods, you live in a bowl, right?
Mm-hmm. It's like a tiny New Orleans or something.
Right. You can't build. Yeah. What I'm also curious to see going forward here over in my neighborhood, I live over in East End here, is there's an enormous amount of new development, including this project that's just down the street here called East River. It's going to be very similar to what you see out at City Center out in Beltway 8, right up where it meets with all the shops and everything.
Yeah.
So exactly. What happens with that over here as well, because they're building it right on the bayou. So
we talked to the Buffalo Bayou Partnership folks a few weeks ago, and that was probably the one thing that I think we didn't talk about very much, because we were talking about just, the revitalization and everything like that. Yeah. And then after we logged off, I was like, oh, wow, but bayous flood. But then it was, I guess, Kat, you can remember that too.
I do. I'm trying to remember if we were on air or not on air.
We were dancing around that subject. That it was just kind of like, this stuff's all great, but what are y'all doing for flood mitigation? And I just didn't ask that because I was, we were just talking about so many other things, and it was a cheerful. Not that this conversation isn't cheerful, but it was a cheerful conversation to where it didn't want to turn into, oh, cool. So you got all this stuff going on, historic revitalization and cultural. What happens when we get another Harvey? Because that would have been just like a
raining on her parade, Craig.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Well, I think part of the restoration effort will help flood mitigation because if you allow those natural grasses and shrubs and all of that have been sort of beaten down or ripped away because of construction or just, building things up on the bayou there, if you allow that to build back up, that serves as not only a bit of a point to kind of soak some of that up, but it can also help to sort of channel some of that flood water in as well, right? Grass and ground are great to help soak up as much. They can't soak it all up, obviously, but they could soak up a lot more than just concrete. Concrete, just let water do its thing with gravity, and it'll just.
Concrete is not a good sponge, it turns out.
No, it's certainly got a lot of that around here. So that's I think something as Houston continues to build out. That we're going to have to battle with, especially the further west you build, and then east side and the northeast side as you get up towards like North Main Street, Cavalcade, swinging on over towards 90 and Crosby. That whole area is starting to get bought up. So those are going to be other areas 10 years down the road we'll have to kind of keep a watch on. So
it's interesting watching that happen. I've been here all my life. I was born here, and Katie was rice fields, and now we're expanding out into all these other places. It's a lot.
Yeah, it really is. So, and I think you can do it. It's just, you have to do it. Smart. You have to do it sustainably, and you have to do it smart. Right. And that kind of goes back to that idea of, there has to be regulations and restrictions put in, and I'll just put on my, politician hat here for a second. That you just have to say no sometimes to developers and say, I know that may not be the best financial move in terms of making revenue or bringing revenue into the city, county, or whomever. But at the same point, you got to think big picture is that if we take away some of this natural sponge, we're not only placing that neighborhood in danger, but we're placing all of the surrounding neighborhoods in danger as well. Which is
the revitalization can't come at the risk of getting it all washed away again. And I mean, not to we are this is a science podcast, and yes, it could get worse. We could things are definitely trending towards. I know right now, like you said, we have the La Nina, there's a drought and everything, but
Yeah.
We could be doing this show in 4 months and talking about, what we just went through. And it's, we just have to be vigilant. And that's why I'm glad that we have you to help us out. And,
Right.
I'm always going to call on you for stuff like this. We'll link back to it. But last year we did a really great video with you as well for the HMS YouTube channel. It was fun watching you deal with the public because we had you, if you remember, we had you in front of that map over there we have in our Texas Wildlife Hall, and people were you were talking and doing your thing, and people were just walking up to you and just asking you questions, taking selfies with you. And it's just
it happens all the time. Yeah, I was going to say it's funny. People ask sometimes, and they'll say, what is it like being on television or when you're out in the public? And I always give them the same analogy because I feel it just fits. I said, imagine going to a party where everyone knows who you are and they know a lot about you, and you don't know anyone at that party.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's kind of,
and they're bringing their entire life with them because they know that. But I'll end with this. That's the funniest thing about Houston. And growing up here, that our weather people are celebrities because in other cities, and we've all traveled here, in other cities, they do not depend on your expertise as much as we do here. Because of the weather situation. So like you guys are so impactful and so such a part of our daily lives.
Yeah.
And it's a cool thing. And especially to have somebody like you with your training. And now I'm just bragging on my friend that has your training and it is just so great at what you do. And we're lucky. So
I appreciate that. I feel very blessed. I feel very lucky to do what I do. I'm like, hey, I'm the psychologist that plays a weather guy on TV. But I take my job very seriously. I do not take myself as serious. But I am always honored and humbled to have someone come up to me in public and say, "Can I ask you a weather question?" Or they'll go, "Gosh, I bet you get tired of talking about weather." And I'm like, "No, I don't. What do you want to know?" Right?
I think we went to a show together. We went to go see Dead and Company last year. And I remember just hearing people come up to you and asking you weather questions. And,
I'll talk for an hour. I love it, because to me, it's an opportunity. I love to let people learn new things. Like, to me, that's the beauty of like getting older and growing and whatnot. Is I feel like if I learn something new every day, man, I've had an awesome day, right? It can be small, it can be big, it doesn't matter. So if I could give someone an opportunity to learn something that they maybe didn't know about the weather, and then they can take that and they can like teach someone else, that's the best.
Education and the weather and crisis management, and you like really cool music.
I try.
What else can you ask for from a weatherman in Houston? Justin Stapleton from KPRC2, thank you very much for logging in with us today.
My pleasure.
I hope your toe gets better.
Yeah, Justin, get better.
I know. Thank you, Kat. You and me both. It's been quite an interesting here on the trials of the toe. We'll see how that goes.
All right, everybody. See y'all next time.
Sounds good.